I really like this little Makita trim router, and with the plunge base it's actually really quite useful. However, there's just one problem with it, and that's that it doesn't support porter cable style router bushings. This is actually a pretty easy problem to solve by replacing the factory Bakelite sub base with an acrylic sub base. So why acrylic, or more importantly, why acrylic over MDF or plywood? Well, we need a material that is dimensionally stable, so all three materials do get that tick there, but MDF isn't going to be able to take this fine lip required for the porter cable style bushings without crumbling pretty quickly. On the other hand, plywood will work if you get a hardwood high quality plywood with many cores in it. Problem is, it's still not as dimensionally stable or as stiff as acrylic at about the 6mm or 1/4 inch thickness. The real nail in the coffin for plywood for this application is that it's really easy to get clear acrylic, a lot harder to get clear plywood. The first step is to remove the factory sub base. In the case of this Makita router, it's 4 flathead Phillips head machine screws. Using the factory base to get the width, the acrylic can be cut to size at the table saw. No fancy blade is needed. Using the factory base again, transfer the screw locations onto the acrylic. Alternatively, if you have a self-centering drill bit, also known as a VIX bit, this can be a much easier way to transfer the holes. I prefer to tape down the base so it doesn't shift while drilling. At the drill press, extend those marks all the way through with a twist bit slightly larger than the diameter of the machine screws. I'm going to reuse the screws that came with my router. They are flathead M4 screws, so I need to countersink the screws that I've just drilled. The best type of bit I've found to countersink pretty much any material, whether it's wood, plastic or metal, is these zero flute type countersinks. They've got just a hole through the middle. Unlike the countersinks that look like a fruit juicer, they don't leave that really awkward pattern. Quite often you'll get like an octagonal pattern rather than a nice smooth circle, and I haven't found any issues at all with tear out, and as I said, these go great in acrylic. I've got a very cheap set that I picked up from eBay somewhere. I think it was about 20 bucks for 4 of them for the different sizes. I'd highly recommend giving something like that a shot. Make sure the countersink is deep enough that the screws sit slightly below the surface. If the original screws are particularly short, you may need a deeper countersink or counter bore. With the layout done, the protective paper can be removed from the acrylic. To find the center location for the guide bushing bore, first screw the new base onto the router. Using a V-bit or other small bit in the router, a small dimple can be put on one side indicating the dead center of the router. The hole can be extended through at the drill press. Use a small twist bit, 1 or 2 millimeters is perfect. You want it all the way through but not too large that it causes an issue for the Forstner bit spur. On the underside of the base, use a 35mm Forstner bit to drill approximately 3mm deep. This should be the depth of the lip of your guide bushings. I'm using a carbide tip bit which chews through acrylic, but it is a lot grabbier. You can see I needed to clamp it down harder than I did. Flip and drill a 32mm hole. This can be 32mm or smaller. This is just to allow the largest router bit possible. So that base is perfectly usable how it is. I can add in any brass bushing, the porter cable style ones, but it would be nice if I had a fence for my plunge base on my trim router. So we may as well add that in now. I'm using M8 hardware, so I'm drilling a 9mm hole for a little bit of clearance and wiggle. These are starter holes for the jigsaw. Using a fine tooth blade on the jigsaw, it gets dropped into one of the holes and I cut a line to the other hole. Rinse and repeat for the other side of the slot. On the acrylic, these receive 10mm holes for even more wiggle room. A router fence doesn't need to be square or anything because of the way the cutter works, so dead squareness isn't an issue and it won't affect accuracy. So just like before, this is now perfectly usable if I wanted a fence on my plunge trim router. The only downside is this isn't the greatest fence we could come up with, and that's largely because I was trying to avoid using your second, third or fourth router if you don't have those sorts of things. It's very difficult to counterbore holes with a jigsaw. So what I'm going to do now is make a new fence using this fence as the guide so that I can make nice counterbored channels for the head of the bolt so it doesn't spin when you're tightening the knob. Then I might dress it up with some hardwood so it's a smoother surface riding up against the workpiece. Because the piece is symmetrical, it can be flipped before making any adjustments to the router fence position. I'm using a 1/4 inch bit, so I'll need to make multiple passes widthwise to clear for the head of the M8 bolt. By loosening the bolts, I can tap the fence over until the edge of the bit lines up with the layout lines. The clearance for the bolt of the head goes down about halfway through the plywood. Then I started the same process for creating the through slot for the body of the bolt. The only difference with that was I flipped the workpiece entirely so that I wasn't going to route into my workbench. It's great that it's all built, but how do you use it? The guide bushing is dropped into the underside of the router base and a retaining nut holds it in place on the other side. This allows bits without bearings to follow templates, like in this example of a square hole. So the fence doesn't have the largest range on it. However, that is by design. It's really meant for small jobs. That's why I have a trim router. If I need to get further in on a workpiece, I'm either going to use my router table, my larger router, or if I only had one router, I'd make a guide or buy a guide that uses the guide rod system, and that would make a lot more sense than just a small edge guide like that. However, this is much better than not having one at all. And this makes one of my favorite little tools a lot more useful. Set me back about $10 and some hardware I had laying around, and it took more time for the glue to dry on the fence than it did any other part of the project, so nice and quick project too. Thanks for watching.